second year medical student, and personally she's a really great friend of ours, a wonderful person both in and out of the classroom. Today she's going to be giving you a talk that is based on her own personal experiences and observations, and really moved me personally, as I hope it does the same to you. So with that, I present Seeing Beyond the Curtain.
25%. I'd like you to conceptualize that number for a moment. 25%. That's 1 in every 4. 25% of the adults in the U.S. in any given year have a mental illness. 25%. 75%. 75% of individuals with mental health symptoms feel that the population is not sympathetic and not caring towards individuals with mental illness. 75%. 38,364. That's the number of individuals who in 2010 successfully took their own life. 38,364. No matter what field you're in or plan to go into, mental illness is not something that can be avoided. It's something that needs to be addressed and something that we all need to feel comfortable talking about. But in all reality, how comfortable is the medical field talking about mental health? When was the last time your physician asked you about your mental health status? I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you my own personal experience with mental health, to give you a little bit of an insight as to what inspired me to give this talk. So I'm the oldest of 3 in my family. My sister is 3 years younger than me, and my brother 3 years younger than her. Growing up, we were all really close, and we spent almost every weekend outside. Every time we went on a hike, my parents had to bring an extra change of clothes because inevitably one of the 3 of us would end up in the creek. As we got older, my sister and I became close. We used to sit by the side of the pool in the summer and play cards and talk about friends and talk about boys. But when I was a junior in high school, that started to change. My sister and I would get into these loud, intense arguments at the drop of a hat. She was going through puberty at the time, so we all blamed it on that. But my family and I became very worried when she started to restrict food intake. And we just couldn't understand why. Why are you yelling all the time? Why won't you eat just those 5 damn chicken nuggets? 6 months down the road, after countless arguments, and slammed doors and a full weekend locked in her room with just 5 Cheerios, my sister admitted herself for anorexia nervosa. At a height of 5'8", she weighed 88 pounds. Suddenly, my parents were under constant scrutiny. Their parenting that was once revered was now ridiculed. I felt isolated. I couldn't talk to anyone. I just didn't have the words or the tact to describe to my friends or my family members what was going on or where my sister was. She was eventually discharged and started gaining weight. And as her cheekbones and her ribs no longer stuck out, and her beautiful blonde hair became thick again, her emotional state got much worse. She'd plummet into these deep lows, lock herself in her room for days on end, sneak downstairs at night to grab food, and yell at anyone that she encountered. I'd always joke with my mom when I came home from school that I could tell how she was doing based on how much we would argue with each other. It was as if she was behind this dark curtain, and we were only allowed occasional glimpses of her true self. Like when we'd stay up all night to watch bad romantic comedies, or make fun of my brother for being so short. My sister tried to kill herself 3 times, and has come close to that more times than I will ever know. Looking for momentary happiness and relief from all it was she was going through, she turned to heroin. She'd disappear for long periods of time, and then lay on the couch for hours on end in a state somewhere between a stupor and unconsciousness. It was during this time that she was diagnosed as bipolar. But it was also during this time that she made it through high school. She traveled to Ghana for 6 months, and she was accepted into college. After her first semester of college, she went to Bolivia to volunteer and summited the highest peak in the country. At the start of her 2nd semester, she left a note in her dorm room and disappeared for 48 hours. She ended up in an inpatient facility in Ohio, because the man whose car she jumped in front of swerved in time and stopped to help her out. After that, she quit school. She came back home, back to the same crowd of people she'd been trying so hard to avoid, and yet her addiction would not let her stay away. She recognized she had a problem and was eventually able to admit herself for heroin abuse. And it was during this admission that she started opening up. And this spring, she was finally able to tell us a little bit about what had been going on. But worried about the impact that would have on our family, and weighed down by that guilt, this summer, she sat in a car and shot up an heroin for herself. I was waiting for a flight home while she was being stabilized in the ICU and eventually moved to the psychiatric floor, waiting to be healthy enough to come home. Since then, she's been 7 months sober, and she is starting to slowly realize that she's talented, that she's passionate, and after 8 years, is starting to see that there might be a future without her illness. From my end, I've been blamed. I've been yelled at. I've had countless doors slammed in my face. But through this, I've come to understand, and I've come to forgive, and I know that I will always be there for her. And now, I'm not up here because I want to garner your sympathy. If you want someone to give sympathy to, give it to my sister. She's the one who's been through hell or back. Or give it to my mother, who gets some of the worst verbal lashings, but will sit on the phone all day arguing with insurance. Or give it to my father, who has sat up countless nights holding her when she's in a bad spot, but goes to work the next day like nothing happened. Or give it to my brother, who, although he's in college across the country, is still terrified of getting that phone call that this time the car didn't swerve, or this time she couldn't be stabilized. We all have our struggles, and when it comes down to it, pain is pain. And I'm not up here to tell you that mine is any better or any worse than yours. That's not the reason that I gave this talk. I wanted to share this part of my life with you all, so that I could also share with you what I've gained from the experience. We need to fight the stigma surrounding mental health. And in order to do that, we need to look at the way that we personally perceive mental illness and the openness with which we talk about it. As a result of the stigma that exists, people are afraid or don't know how to talk about mental health. I can't even tell you how many times I had a friend or family member come up to me, and you could sense their anxiety as they're trying to decide whether to ask me about my sister or not. They take the plunge. But the minute that I said something like anxiety or bipolar, she's been a little depressed this week, it was as if for them, the conversation suddenly changed to something that we should no longer be having in public. As future physicians, we are at the forefront of structuring how mental health is perceived in the population. Current physicians look to us to bring new ideas and new viewpoints to medicine. Patients will eventually look to us for the answers to their questions and to be providers of information. And it's because of this unique status that our role in structuring the perception around mental health becomes crucial. But before we can do anything on a societal level, we need to first look at the way that we personally perceive mental health in 3 different ways. First, we need to start seeing mental illness as the same thing as every other chronic condition, not as something completely foreign and different. Like hypertension, diabetes, cancer, mental illness is not restricted to one specialty. And when it comes down to the impact that it has on an individual's life, on an individual's health, on an individual's family members, it's in that same category as every other chronic condition. Second, we as physicians, it's our responsibility to separate the curtain and see the individual behind the mental illness. With my sister, I've seen her go from an energetic, dynamic woman with this full love of life to someone that I wasn't able to recognize. And through this process, I came to understand that I needed to separate my sister from her illness. That person sitting there screaming at me, slamming that door in my face, that's her illness. That's not her. the person that loves to travel and bad romantic comedies. That's my sister. And she's still there, just behind this curtain of her mental illness. Now it's our responsibility to separate that curtain and reach out to our patients that have passions and interests, that are behind the curtain of schizophrenia, anxiety, bipolar, and not blow them off as some crazy in bed for. We are not treating depressed patients. We're treating patients with depression. Their disease does not define them. They exist as an individual beyond their diagnosis. Third, we need to stop belittling mental illness. Whether it's a person with crippling schizophrenia or a patient's first time talking to you about their anxiety, we need to respect every aspect of mental illness. Stop blaming it on mommy and daddy issues. Don't expect a patient to just be able to snap out of it. As a mentor once told me, patients don't commit suicide any more than they commit pulmonary embolism. Suicide's not a choice. It's a symptom of a disease. Stop blaming the patient and start recognizing that the pain that these patients suffer is very real. We need to respect all it is that these patients are going through and stop chalking it up to an inability to handle life. It's these three changes in our mentality, from seeing mental illness as a chronic illness, to separating the curtain and reaching out to the individual behind it, to respecting mental illness for all it is. These three changes will go a long way to fighting the skewed perception of mental health. All this work is for naught if we're not comfortable talking about mental illness with the same openness that we talk about every other chronic condition. Now, my sister's history is always under family medical history on my chart. And my family's history of skin cancer has prompted physicians to ask if I wear sunscreen in the summer. And my family history of hypertension and obesity has prompted physicians to ask about my exercise and diet. But never once have I been asked about my mental health. Despite the strong genetic connection with mental illness, despite the stress that a chronic illness can cause a family member, never once. As a field, we're comfortable providing our female patients with yearly pelvic exams and our male patients with prostate exams, but we're not comfortable talking about mental health. Numbers like 25% of the population demand that you be as comfortable talking about mental illness as you are talking about diabetes. 40% of patients that commit suicide have seen a physician within 1 month prior to their death. 20% have seen a physician within 24 hours. With how many of these patients was mental illness quickly glanced over? With how many was it not asked? How many patients are left isolated because we are not comfortable talking about mental health? If adding one question to your history could reduce 38,364, even by one, wouldn't that be worth it? Let's take a moment at some point today and reflect a little bit about our own personal perception of mental health. And let's work to improve it. If I was to come into your office and you saw what I had on my chart, would you ask me about my mental health? How is it that you talk to a patient with depression? Are you able to see the individual with passions and interests that's behind the schizophrenia? Let's start talking openly about mental health. Let's talk about mental illness. There is no reason for the stigma surrounding mental illness to exist. And the way that it ends starts with us.